All right, so we're going to continue to look here at the Civil War. In Lincoln's inaugural address, he actually declared that secession is legally void, which means that those states that seceded did not have the legal right to do so. And so in the mind of Abraham Lincoln, this was not a war between two countries. It is a civil war. Now, we call it the Civil War, correct? We don't call it the American Confederate War because the Confederacy was never a country. Despite what they claimed, right? When you have a war between two countries, you name it after those two countries who were at war, right? This was not that. We call it the Civil War because a civil war takes place between people of the same country. So as much as the Confederacy wants to act like that they have now created their own country, the United States never sees it that way. And because the United States wins, they get to shape the history. Now, it's a crazy movie. I found it like when I was in high school, but it's like, what if the Confederacy won? What would the United States look like if the Confederacy had actually won the Civil War? And people have kind of gone down into this historical, what if scenarios, which aren't really that helpful, but they're interesting to kind of see what people think would have happened. It's not good. Not great. But what would have ended up happening? So that's another one that's interesting to watch. But he did not intend to invade. Lincoln did not intend to invade the southern states, but he also decided that he would use force to maintain possession of the federal property in those states if he had to. So attention is quickly going to shift to a federal installation called Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter, you need to know for quiz purposes, is going to be the first official battle of the Civil War. This is a fort that is out in the Bay in Charleston, South Carolina, right in the mix of the secession fever, right? There's a fort. It guarded the bay, the port there. It guarded the coast, and it was loaded up. Now, the fort was in need of supplies, and Lincoln was very intent on resupplying it. The Confederacy, South Carolina in particular, said, no, we're going to take that fort, and now it belongs to the Confederacy. Lincoln says, no, it ain't. So South Carolina sent a letter to the soldiers that were there out on this island. Hey, evacuate the fort. We're going to let you go. We don't want to hurt you or anything. The commanding officer there was a guy named Major Anderson, Robert Anderson. He obviously refuses. He's not going to concede a very strategically placed and important fort out off the coast of a rebelling state. He's not just going to give it up. So on April 12th of 1861, Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard fires on the fort, okay? And he starts shooting cannons. The soldiers at the fort then return fire. Now, interestingly enough, little Jeopardy knowledge here, the person that was at the fort that was in charge of returning cannon fire, he was the main guy in charge of the cannons there, and was a guy by the name of Edward Doubleday. Okay, now you may have. Does anybody know the name Doubleday? Has anybody ever heard that name before? Doubleday, or Abner Doubleday? My bad, Abner Doubleday. Abner Doubleday is credited with inventing baseball. He also fired the first Union shots in the Civil War. So, he's a war hero. Later on, writes down some rudimentary rules, and is then credited later on with inventing the game of baseball. But he was also at Fort Sumter at the beginning of the Civil War, which is kind of cool. Now, it's kind of a mythological kind of story at this point. They've done quite a bit of investigating. There's no indication that Doubleday was where they said he was in Cooperstown, New York, which is where they say the rules originally came up. There's no proof that he was there and wrote them there, that he actually invented the rules, but he may have copied down rules that somebody else had already come up with. But they credited for it anyways. And if you ever go to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, there's a baseball field there called Doubleday Field, named after Abner Doubleday, who they gave credit to inventing baseball. That's a little bit of an aside, but I think it's interesting because who knew? The great American sport was invented by a great American who fought valiantly in the Civil War. So it didn't really matter that he fired back, though, because they had no supplies. And while they fought back against the Confederates, they eventually surrendered the fort on April 13th. The Union troops are able to evacuate. But in response to this attack, Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months to suppress this rebellion. Now, he says, I need 75,000 guys. We're going to go down there. We're going to end this thing in 3 months. He was wrong, right? This is going to be 750,000 casualties over the course of 4 years. So Lincoln thought that he'd be able to do a little bit better than he ended up being able to do. But it was probably because Buchanan had allowed this infrastructure of the Confederacy to build for 3 months instead of going down there with 75,000 troops. Buchanan could have knocked this out before it even started. If he'd have done what Lincoln did, 75,000 troops, we're going to go down there 3 months. All these states that are trying to secede, we're going to hang all these people that said that you're allowed to, because that's treason. They literally are committing treason. The punishment for that is death. We're going to kill all of them. We're going to have them hold new elections, and the people that get elected, if they want to vote to secede, we'll kill them too as traitors. And we'll do this as long as it takes until you realize you're not leaving. But Buchanan didn't do that, so 75,000 troops isn't going to do very much. The assault on Fort Sumter and subsequent calls for troops provoked several of the upper South states to join the Confederacy. Remember, there was only 7 to begin. Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia had not actually joined yet. They were hoping that there would be a compromise, that war was not inevitable. Now that it's clear Abraham Lincoln's going to use troops, they go, heck with that. We're going to withdraw as well. This Confederate nation is obviously predicated on the institution of slavery. But Southerners, couched their defense of slavery as a preservation of states' rights. And as we said, that's kind of how they try to sell it. Oh, it's about states' rights. It's about states' rights. Yeah, the states' right to protect slavery. Yeah, states' rights. So the Confederate Constitution left even less power to the states than the U.S. Constitution, which is pretty funny because the Confederate Constitution actually had less states' rights than the Constitution that the states who left said they were leaving because they didn't have states' rights. So they created their own Constitution that had less states' rights, which is pretty funny. Shortly after Lincoln's call for troops, the Union adopted the General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. That's his title, General-in-Chief. He comes up with this idea called the Anaconda Plan, okay? And this is his plan to kind of suppress the rebellion. You need to know about the Anaconda Plan. Winfield Scott, Anaconda Plan. The idea is that this strategy is going to strangle the Confederacy, okay? What they're going to do is they're going to take their Navy, because the U.S. has a Navy, the Confederacy really doesn't. The U.S. is going to take their Navy, surround the southern coast so that no supplies can get to the South. Then they're going to use troops to go in and cut off all the supply routes by train and stuff, and they're basically just going to choke them out, right? They're basically laying siege to the entire southern United States. So they're going to choke them like an anaconda would. And so ground troops, again, this idea is they're going to go in and win, but it's not going to work out well. The border states of Delaware and Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, they actually end up staying kind of neutral, I guess. Remember, Missouri has slavery, but they're really, they don't want to choose sides. They stay with the North, but they're kind of middle of the road. They're playing both sides to some extent. They don't want to pick sides, even though they don't join the Confederacy, right? And it's really important that Lincoln realizes that if he loses these border states, that he could lose the whole thing. His military advisors realize that if they lose these important states, Kentucky, Missouri, they're going to lose very significant resources, food, railroads, water access to the Mississippi, right? You have St. Louis, Missouri, that is a bustling trade port, and it's from there that you have lots of rail lines going all over the place. So they need Missouri not to like go and join the Confederacy. That would really hurt them. So Lincoln tries to basically butter them up, right? He basically wants loyalty among their citizens. The Union forces minimize how occupied that territory is. And pretty much all 4 of the border states remain loyal to the Union throughout the war, which is really probably the most important thing that Lincoln did more than anything else, was to not push those 4 states away. You also have the entire world watching. Most of Europe, they're watching this with deep interest because the United States represents this example of democratic thought, this shining example of what democracy could be. If it fails so early, can democracy really be a viable option for a government? Right, guys? Britain, France, Spain, Russia, they're all following this very closely. Now, they also want the United States to succeed, but they also don't want to piss off the South, because the South makes all the cotton, and they make for all the clothes and all the things that are made in the Industrial Revolution. The South has all of that. And so they also know that if they cut off the South and they don't support them at all, that they could lose access to very important goods. And so the whole world is kind of like, what's going to happen? Slavery is also coming to the front of everybody's mind. Lincoln and his cabinet devised strategies to defeat the rebel insurrection. Black Americans quickly used the Civil War as a way to force the issue of slavery to the front of the debate. As early as 1861, Black Americans are asking Lincoln, hey, let us join the Army, let us join the Navy. We want to fight for our own freedom, right? However, Lincoln doesn't want to do that. He's trying to be conservative. He's trying to, have more of a limited war. He also understands, remember, that balance of those border states. If he does something to make them mad, like, let black people fight in the Army, they might leave. That might be the thing that pushes them over the edge. And so he has to be very careful on this. And you need to remember that, kind of for quiz purposes, that one of the main reasons he didn't want to let black people fight in the Army was because he worried that it would push people in like Missouri and Kentucky who had slaves to the Confederacy. So he's very cautious about this. However, Army commanders could not ignore that the growing populations of formerly enslaved people were showing up, right? And these former slaves took a proactive stance very early on in the war, really trying to force the government to allow them to fight. As the number of these escaped slaves and freed blacks that want to fight grows, Lincoln and Congress find it harder to ignore them. So by May of 1861, a guy by the name of General Butler goes over his superiors' heads. He begins accepting fugitive slaves into his ranks and arming them in Virginia. And he reasoned basically that a fugitive slave is no different than contraband of war. You know, like what contraband is of war? So like when an army goes in and they capture someone's cows, they're allowed to eat the cows and use the cows how they see fit, right? Because they took them from you. Well, he said, it's no different than slaves. If we come in and your slaves come to our side, why wouldn't we use them to fight against you, right? And so basically, Congress sees what he does and they're like, hey, that's a good way of thinking about it. And they actually pass something called the First Confiscation Act that labeled runaway slaves as contraband and that they could be used however Union generals or Union officials saw fit. Now, most of the time, this was not in using them in fighting, like almost at all. Most of the time, the freed slaves would show up. They go, hey, we want to help. What can we do to help? They'd say, hey, we really need to dig some ditches, right? Because, or we need to dig trenches. We need to build some barricades. We need to build, a bridge to get over this river, right? To them, that was just as beneficial as somebody who was, going out there with a gun. And so while they didn't trust to give them weapons, they did allow them to, support the war in other ways. And most slaves are going to seize this opportunity. They do prove helpful to the war effort. Every escaped slave also served as a loss to the Confederate war effort, obviously. And so it was very important for them to say, hey, if you come to us, the Confederacy can't use you for anything, so come on. Now, Lincoln thought 3 months this is going to be over, right? Well, that got put to bed pretty quick. And here at the very first battle of the Civil War, the first between two armies, and you need to know that, was at a place called Manassas. It's the first battle of Bull Run. Now, I want you to kind of imagine this. It's not particularly deadly, but Manassas is probably a half day's ride by horse or carriage out of Washington, D.C. I mean, Richmond and Washington are not very far from each other. So the two capitals of the Confederacy and the U.S., pretty close to each other. They basically meet between those two places and they have a battle. The Union is pretty cocky. The people in Washington, D.C. are pretty cocky. Hey, we're going to send this army. We're going to defeat these Confederates. We're going to show them who's boss pretty quick. They'll realize they have no chance. They'll give up. This whole thing will be over. People went out from Washington, D.C., like the elites and stuff, in carriages and set up a picnic to watch this battle. They're like, get your popcorn. Don't forget, let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Right? No? You haven't been in the movies lately? Okay. Since like 1960. So, all right. But anyways, they got their red vines. They got their Mr. Pibb. They got their popcorn. Right? They set out their picnic blankets. They're going to watch the Union whip up on the Confederates. And then this whole thing will be over, and then we can go back home by dinner time, and it's all going to be over. That ain't how it worked out. The Confederates won the battle. Wasn't particularly deadly, but the Civil War is pretty obviously not going to be 3 months based on this, right? Lincoln, after they get beat, Lincoln's like, oh, this guy, Irvin McDowell, he's a brigadier general. He was in charge of the battle. He goes, oh, you suck. You're fired. You fired. He fired him like after one battle. The dude lost, and he's like, you made us look really stupid. You suck. Get out of here. And he promotes a guy named George McClellan to the commander of this newly formed Army of the Potomac. And for nearly a year after the first Battle of Bull Run, the Eastern Theater remains basically silent. Washington, D.C. and Richmond become super fortified, so nobody can get in or out of either of those places. But smaller engagements that do take place really just show it's going to be kind of a stalemate. It's just you win one, you lose one, you win one, you lose one. Okay. While the military remained quiet, the same could not be said of the Republicans in Washington. While the Southern Democrats are gone, the Republicans are basically in control of all of Congress, the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they go about passing tons of legislation to change the country. They passed something called the Homestead Act, which is a super duper big piece of important legislation after the Civil War in particular, in that it's going to revolutionize the way in which the West is opened up. Basically, they open it up and they say, go get it, and you go and stake out 160 acres, and it's yours, like for the whole country. It's crazy. They passed the Land Grant College Act, or known as the Morrill Act. This is a super important one because the Morrill Act, or the Land Grant College Act, actually takes federal land, creates and uses it to create universities that are focused on agriculture and engineering. One of these colleges would be Louisiana State University A&M. Y'all know about that one? Yeah, that would be LSU. Okay? LSU is an A&M school. The official name of Louisiana State University is Louisiana State University of Agriculture and Mechanics. Okay? Just like Texas A&M, Texas University of Agriculture and Mechanics, or Agriculture and Mechanics University. Maybe LSANMU. I don't know. I'd have to look at this crest again. But it's written on there. You just never realize it, right? These colleges are formed directly as a basis of this Land Grant College Act. So any A&M school is because of this, okay? Now, when they originally created LSU, they wanted to go somewhere that had lots of farmlands, close to the river. At the time, and this is obviously, they used the Land Grant College Act after the Civil War. But they looked for a place that has lots of farmland, that's big and open, and so they picked Pineville, Louisiana, right? And so LSU was originally in Pineville, and then much later, or a decade or so later, moves to Baton Rouge. But you've driven by it many, many times, as you probably know. Yes? Y'all know where it's at? Yeah, the VA. The VA was LSU. And so, it's super interesting that was done there. The Pacific Railroad Act is also one that they start deciding that they're going to connect, the Transcontinental Railroad. They're going to start doing some of that stuff and working towards putting railroads everywhere. Federal government is moving toward more nationally controlled currency system, the greenback system. And these are going to be very instrumental to the later expansion of the federal government. The Democrat Party doesn't know what to do. You have war Democrats that are all about the war. They stand behind Lincoln. But there's another group that are sympathetic to the Confederacy that remain in the North. They're sympathetic. They're pro-slavery, but they're from the North. These are called Copperheads, and you need to remember what they're called. They are pro-war, or they are, sympathetic to the South. They try to make Lincoln look like an idiot. They try and stand in the way of his policies. They want to make the Union kind of be forced into negotiating peace with the Confederacy. If they had been successful and the United States recognized the Confederacy as its own country, that would have been it. Civil War, no more. Everyday life is kind of monotonous with brief periods of horror. Soldiers' lives revolve around routines filled with basically drilling in the morning, doing drills, eating meals, and marching. Okay? Both armies grow very weary of this routine. It causes discontent on both sides. They develop very clever ways of distracting themselves from boredom, like writing letters, writing songs, playing baseball. They played lots of baseball. And in the Civil War documentary that I mentioned earlier, he spends quite a bit of time talking about the idea that, like, in camp, they're sitting there playing baseball all the time. Like, they would set up camp, get all the tents done, have dinner, and then they'd be like, hey, anybody up for some ball? And they would play. Prisoner of war camps, they played baseball. So they'd capture Union soldiers or Confederate soldiers, take them to prison camp, and they'd be like, all right, y'all versus us. And then they played baseball all the time. That's how it kind of becomes America's game. It becomes the most popular sport in America because every man that basically fought in the Civil War was exposed to it. And so then when the Civil War ends, they go back home to all their different communities, and they're like, hey, let me show you this game. Let's play some baseball. In fact, at one point, there were thousands of professional, semi-professional baseball teams around the country. I mean, thousands. Craziness. Camp life was overwhelmingly male, not very many women at all. They drank, they smoked, they cussed, they gambled, they fought. Boxing was a big deal, They played music. They raced on horseback. They raced on foot. They played, as I said, played baseball. Neither side could consistently provide supplies for their soldiers. And so sometimes Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers would even trade with each other. They'd be like, hey, we need some beef jerky. And they're like, well, we ran out of baseballs. And they're like, well, here, some baseballs for beef jerky. Like, there was very poor sanitation. Thousands and thousands of men living in a place that has no plumbing. They're just pooping in holes, probably by the river, and then drinking the water, right? Awful disease would spread. And again, it was just lice, terrible. Just, the Civil War wasn't fun for anybody, really. I mean, it was just gross. And that's not even counting all the people that got, like, infections from being shot and having their legs cut off and all that stuff. Music was very popular. And one of your readings is actually a couple songs written during the Civil War. One of them is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which most of you probably are at least aware of. The other one is, I'm trying to remember what the other one is. But these songs became very popular. General McClellan was overly cautious, which led to several failures on part of the Union military. He went on something called the Peninsular Campaign. He thwarts the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, which was thwarted by Robert E. Lee because he had an opportunity to actually defeat Lee, and then basically was too cautious. So they find out that Lee is like split his army in two pieces. They like find a piece of paper that this is written on. McClellan thinks that it's a trick, that if he goes after one, that it's going to be an ambush, but in reality it was a true piece of intelligence. He could have gone and defeated Lee. The war probably would have been over in 1862. It would have been done because he would have defeated Lee, but instead he was like, no, it's a trap. We should wait until we get more reinforcements. And then by then it was too late, and he ends up being beaten by Lee because Lee's army splits and then surrounds them. Instead of taking one of them on head on when it was split, he had to fight both of them from both directions. And so this was a problem constantly. But in the West, you have guys like General Ulysses S. Grant, who don't give a crap at all. He was a bad to the bone dude. He captured several forts. He gains control of the Mississippi River, enacting this Anaconda Plan. There's deadly clashes with Confederates. It shocks both the Union and the Confederate forces. One of the biggest battles, one of the worst battles for sure, took place on April 6th and 7th of 1862 at a place called Shiloh. And it only lasted 2 days, but it accounted for over 23,000 deaths. Now, to kind of put that in perspective, 2 days, 23,000 deaths, that's about 500 dead every hour for 2 days straight. Think about that. 500 people dead. Like if somebody's holding hostages and they're like, I'm going to kill one person every hour, be like, oh my gosh, give them whatever they want. They're going to kill somebody. This is 500 people every hour for 2 days straight died. That was more than any other war that the United States had taken part of combined in 1 day. Grant eventually goes and gets down to New Orleans, captures the city of New Orleans, and deals a very heavy blow to the Confederates. And there's a whole lot more about Grant's story. The Union and Confederate navies hinder any movement on the Marine front. Confederates had to construct a navy from scratch. The Union is successfully implementing the Anaconda Plan and squeezing the South's economy. But new inventions like the idea of ironclad ships are going to basically put an end to the wooden ships during the Civil War. They take wooden ships, cover them in iron, and then they have battles, which is kind of stupid. Like one of the battles lasted for like 2 days because they'd take iron that was like this thick and put it on top of their boats, and then they'd shoot cannons. The balls would just bounce off, and they couldn't attack each other's boats because they were so covered in iron. So like they just like end up like bumping into each other a bunch and trying to sink each other, and they never do. But that pretty much shows like, oh, you put some iron on a boat, it's not gonna, yeah, like wooden ships are not going to do very well against it. So obviously, now African Americans, again, really pushing the emancipation goals. Congress does make some efforts toward this. They abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. They passed the Second Confiscation Act, which even makes it more that basically if you go into a place and you capture slaves, you can set them free. Not just that they escape, but if you go in and capture them, you set them free. But Abraham Lincoln starts to evolve his thinking on this. He had his initial idea of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, but his Secretary of State, William Seward, says, hey, you don't want to just issue this statement where you're going to free slaves to make it look like that's your last choice. Now, we all know about the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Everybody? Okay, make something clear. How many slaves did the Emancipation Proclamation free? Don't know. 0. The Emancipation Proclamation freed 0 slaves. None. Okay? The Emancipation Proclamation essentially said that any enslaved person that is living in an area that is in rebellion to the United States is set free. Now, here's the crazy part about this. Everybody goes, Abraham Lincoln, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. What a great guy. Okay, that's fine, but he's a great guy for different reasons. He didn't free anybody. The people he freed were in the Confederacy, and the Confederacy didn't see him as their president, which means they didn't have to listen to him. Now, what's crazy is Missouri and Kentucky were still in the United States, correct? They didn't go to the Confederacy. There was slavery in Missouri and Kentucky, and he didn't free them. And he was actually their president. So he freed people that he wasn't president of and did not free people that he was president of. Why did he do this? Well, it wasn't so much about freeing the slaves. In fact, there's a quote from Abraham Lincoln who said, if I could win the Civil War and not free any slaves, I would do it. And if it takes freeing all of the slaves to win the Civil War, I'll do that too. But the goal is to win the Civil War. It was not to free the slaves. Okay? Abraham Lincoln frees the slaves and gets known as this great emancipator. Not that he didn't sign it. I'm not saying men didn't sign it. I'm simply saying that it's not everything you may have always thought it was going to be. So in the fall of 1862, they fight a battle called Antietam at Antietam Creek. It's the single bloodiest day in American history. Okay? Single bloodiest day in American history. You need to know that for quiz purposes. Over 20,000 soldiers die in a single day of fighting on a single battlefield. 20,000 soldiers in one day. Let's say they fought for 12 hours. You're talking 1,500, 1,700 people an hour. An hour. 60 minutes in an hour. I mean, what is that? That's like 20, 30 people a minute. Somebody died at Antietam every 2 seconds for 12 hours straight. They said the battlefield of Antietam was so muddy by the end of it that you couldn't pull a wagon across it. But it didn't rain that day. It was so full of blood. The ground was so full of blood that it was so muddy you couldn't pull a wagon across it the next day. So when you think about 20,000 people dying. So obviously the Confederates eventually withdraw because of the high death toll. It's hard to say it was a good victory for the Union, but it was enough for Lincoln to be able to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed slaves in areas controlled by the Confederacy. And they didn't think he was the president, so, it does provide vital, ammunition to shift the war from being about preserving the Union to really being about the end of slavery. It was more of a moral victory for the emancipation people. And it also did one other thing. Now, this is the one thing that it actually does do. When he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he makes it clear the United States is fighting to end slavery. Europe had already outlawed slavery. This means that Europe has no choice but to side with the United States and not the Confederacy. Because now, when both sides allowed slavery, you're both bad. But now, one side does and one side doesn't. We got to go with the side that doesn't allow slavery. Okay? So that does make a big difference. Despite the fact that the Confederacy was clearly losing, there was no real way for them to win. They continue to fight and continue to fight and continue to fight. And so they don't care. They're going to continue to do what they have to do. And that's going to take us to the last section here tomorrow.